Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. Um, Today, we are going to have uh, a discussion on the First World War. Um, Now, because I am not as skeptical of experts as my friend here, I will specify by saying that neither he nor I are trained historians. Um, but over the years, we've read quite a bit, or we've read the articles and watched videos about World War II. And of course, you just absorb a lot about it from the overall culture, since it was such an important event in world history and U.S. history. Um, and but at the end of the day, I guess you could say we're sort of debating the proposition, or we are debating the proposition. Uh, the U.S. involvement in World War II was necessary. I am for the proposition, and he is against the proposition. We didn't do a lot of extra research, um, so this won't be an extremely formal discussion. But we hope to get something. We hope the audience gets something out of it, and we're curious to hear each other's takes on this particularly interesting period in history. Uh, with all that out of the way, I guess I'll just begin by giving a little bit of background on my position. My co-host can lay out his, and then we'll go back and forth for an hour. So I think the the standard narrative about World War II, I think it's correct, or I think it's mostly correct, but I think it's incomplete. So I think that a lot of people, and this is true of like history overall, um, they gloss over certain aspects of history, or certain aspects of the people that they like in history. Um, they gloss over, maybe the bad done by people that they approve of, or the sides that they approve of, or the movements they approve of. Um, they might demonize certain people for certain reasons. Um, and so it's very easy to be very lazy in one's historical interpretation. It's very easy to be lazy in one's historical interpretations. Um, and in many ways, the what is fed to us about World War II does come down to a certain mythology that has arose around these events. Um, so while I will be defending the idea that the U.S. should have gotten involved in the conflict, I'm not going to sit here and defend the establishment's um, an establishment person's interpretation of events, or at least their way they present these events, because generally it is simplistic, and in that sense incorrect. Um, so I think I'll let Matt jump in here.
So I think I have a much different I have a much different perspective in the sense that I'm taking the con side of the argument, right? So I'm going to talk about why I don't think it was necessary for the United States to get involved in World War II. So a couple things that kind of flow into this have to do with, you have to talk about the character of FDR and a lot of what his intuitions were and what a lot of things that guided him into the war and a lot of the surroundings in United States, Germany, and Japanese relationships leading up to the war. And I think a lot of the way that we learn it in school, and one of the reasons I'm so skeptical that it is necessary, is because a lot of the basic reasoning you get just doesn't make sense. So it'll kind of be like about how we got into World War II to stop the Nazis, but it's like, but we didn't actually get into the war until Pearl Harbor. So I was always skeptical because the way that it's delivered to, I guess, 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds is in a way that's like clearly not detailed. And it's just kind of like, yeah, a lot of bad stuff happened. So then we went and fought the war and everybody clapped. And I just wasn't, and when as I got older, I wasn't satisfied with that. I just wanted to know more about it, and I just kind of stumbled onto things that were just kind of they kind of rubbed me the wrong way in terms of assuming the war is necessary, and a lot of that comes down to Japan and Germany itself, and how where I think they would have gone if we didn't get into the war, especially on Germany's front, because of some of Germany's goals. I don't think would have been successful in the long run. So even if Germany was essentially allowed to continue with the regime it had, I don't see why it would have lasted for a significant amount of time and accumulated more power. I think it was always going in a direction that would inevitably destroy the regime. So that's one of the key claims I'm going to make about like why I don't think the war was necessary. Um, so yeah, I think that's just the basic parameters I'd lie down. And the other thing I want to mention, and I know you gave this disclaimer up front, but we're not historians, and we haven't like dedicated a disproportionate amount of time for this topic alone. We talk about all kinds of things on this episode. We talk about things that are like Jordan Peterson debates, and when we talk about that, like you've read a bunch of Sam Harris books, I've read Jordan Peterson's books, I've read like one of Sam Harris's books, stuff like that. But it's not like we've sat there and read through like 6 different 700-page tomes about World War II and the intentions leading into it. And there are people who've done that, and they know more than us. But I guess the best crowd for this episode is people who know a little bit about World War II and are open to interpreting the events, and will have the curiosity to explore things they hear us say that might not have been things they had thought about. So if you hear us, talk about FDR's, what FDR was thinking well before Pearl Harbor, and that catches you off guard, then that's something you can follow up on. If you hear Matt say a point about, I don't know why he thought this was absolutely necessary, and he pulls out a fact that I wasn't familiar with, or it's just something that's kind of niche, but it's interesting that he's caught, then it's something you can follow up on. So I just wanted to preface it by giving that, and saying that's how we can be useful. Okay, so do you want to dive into, I guess, a more specific view of like, I guess, how you perceive the United States getting into the war? And I think that's like the inevitable starting point. So, okay.
But before I say that, I guess I just want to add up something to your disclaimer, in that just because we're not professional historians doesn't mean we can't explore these ideas, doesn't mean we don't have something to say about it. It means that our knowledge of specific facts or events is probably less than someone who got a PhD in the subject. But I think it's good to have these conversations, and I think even laymen, even people who aren't professionals or aren't professional historians should explore history, and should think about these questions, because history is important, and it helps you understand the present and all that cliche stuff. But also, it's about empowering the individual to think for himself, or empowering the individual to explore a topic and not feel like they don't have anything to say, or they're not able to, just because they don't have any credentials. Is that a fair point to make?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, we whenever we talk about things like our moral intuitions and stuff like that, we're talking about ideas that we read from people who are experts, even though we don't have PhDs in their fields, and we aren't actually working in those fields. So you always have to take that with a grain of salt. But you have to remember, like, well, if you do read books from the greats, generally you have a lot more knowledge than just, yeah, it's still useful to have that knowledge. So yeah, I'm totally there with you.
But anyway, I'll get to the heart of the matter. So as everyone knows, World War II began in 1939. Germany began to expand beyond its borders. But before then, of course, I think Germany had been given a little territory, because people like Neville Chamberlain, a guy who ran a prime minister of Great Britain, thought, okay, let's just give Hitler a little territory, and hopefully that'll satiate his appetite, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. Um, and of course, even before that, there was the First World War. Um, and the interesting thing about that, of course, is how harsh the Allies were on Germany and the Allies, and the that's actually a fact that I think a lot of people don't often realize. So the um, I know this is a slight historical change, but I'm just trying to give a little context here. The reason Germany was in such a terrible place, and the reason that people like Hitler came to power at some level, not completely, but a part of it was they owed the reparations they had to pay the Allied powers, were really too great for them to bear. And it was less of, and when Germany and their allies lost World War II, it wasn't a question of about trying to maintain peace on the continent, on Europe. It wasn't about maintaining peace in Europe. It was about punishing Germany for the wrong they did, um, which I'm sure they did plenty of wrong in World War II. But um, it's possible that World War II, or I meant they did a lot of wrong in World War I, I'm sure, but it's possible that World War II could have been avoided, or it wouldn't have looked the same had the Germany not been so mistreated by the other countries in Europe. But anyway, so Hitler, Nazi Germany expands their reach to pretty much all of Europe except for Great Britain. Great Britain is close to they weren't far off from being completely conquered, but they were holding off as much as possible. Churchill, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, said, we will not surrender no matter what. He kept he tried to keep morale up, and of course, then the U.S. Entered the war in order basically to help Great Britain as an ally. Because we were allies with Great Britain, we went and entered the war. And so that's really my first main point. Um, I, I think if we had not entered the war, there is a good amount of evidence that Britain would have been conquered by Nazi Germany. And I just don't think that would have been. I mean, no one's going to say, unless you're like a hardcore neo-Nazi, no one's going to say that would be a good thing. So that's kind of silly to even have to point out. But it would have been really atrocious if Nazi Germany had conquered all of Europe. Now, of course, they didn't conquer Russia. That's a bit of a different matter. But if they conquered all of mainland Europe, I think that would have been a major turning point in their favor. And I think that would have been dangerous in terms of not only European politics, but just global politics as a whole. So I guess I'll stop there, as that's the first point of my argument.
Okay. Okay. I think that's interesting, and I'll preface my thoughts by saying I don't know a ton about in terms of how likely Britain was to fall without U.S. aid, but I don't think I wouldn't say that would be a pivotal point to make that would, I guess, undo my argument, right? So what I'm thinking in my head is, even if Nazi Germany takes Britain, I think it was always doomed to fail. And I think one of the reasons it was doomed to fail is because of their economic policy agenda and for Hitler's his desire to take over essentially Russia, because he saw Russians as, people that were like the chosen people. He saw them as like, the beautiful Aryan race, and he wanted to have one nation with them. And it was always part of his goals to eventually absorb Russia. And I think that was always going to be the front that would always do him in, combined with his economics. So I don't think taking on Britain and actually occupying Britain and putting it under his regime's name, I don't see why that would then all of a sudden give him the power to do the things that I don't suspect he'd be able to do. So I think that's an interesting line of thought, and it makes sense in the sense that that's why the U.S. was, somewhat indirectly involved with the war even before Pearl Harbor. But I don't think that's it's not a conclusion that makes me think, okay, well, that guarantees the U.S. needed to be involved, because I still see it as Germany wanted to be self-sufficient to some degree after World War One. They thought the world kind of screwed them, right, because of all the penalties they got from their involvement in World War One, and their nation was kind of cut into pieces where a bunch of people who were like German populations were arbitrarily kind of placed in other countries, which is some of the first and easiest places for German to take back when they were expanding. It's because a lot of the populations that they were taking back over were kind of sympathetic to the Germans because they were Germans until World War One like arbitrarily changed those areas. So because they had this goal of autarky, I don't think their economics would ever work out because there was no incentive for them to be efficient. Because when you want a self-sustaining system, you have to do everything in-house, which means you can't reap any of the gains of outsourcing to countries that have better resources, more resources, or like lower educated populations that will do things for a lot cheaper. So that means you're doing pretty much everything in the most inefficient ways possible. And that's why economically isolationist policies end up making the nation poorer. So that combined with wanting to take over Russia are reasons why I think Nazi Germany was kind of doomed to fail. I don't think them overtaking Britain is relevant to that, which is why I think it's interesting what you bring up, but I don't know if it changes my thinking at all.
So, of course, at some level, we're entering the territory of speculative history. Um, Given the war ended up the way it did, it's kind of hard to figure out, well, what would have happened if, this had happened instead of that. But I guess I would need to hear more about um, about your. I would want to hear your argument more fleshed out, more about Nazi Germany sort of being destined to fail, because in terms of the people who were involved in the war, um, you know, so being in 2020, we know the war began in 1939 and ended in continental Europe in 45 and in the Pacific in 47. But when the U.S. entered the war in you said 41, I think it was, they it was not a foregone conclusion that that the Allies were necessarily going to win this war, or that the Nazis were necessarily going to self-destruct. Nobody really knew how long this conflict was going to take, or how long the war was going to go on. No one really knew what was going to happen. A lot of things were up in the air. It was all very complicated. And I'm a little less convinced, I guess, of the argument that Nazi Germany was bound to fail. Now, of course, perhaps we may need to make a slight distinction between, say, the Nazi regime and Hitler himself. Because there's a question of like, well, if Hitler, died when he did, but not like if Nazi Germany had taken over all of Europe, but then Hitler died, like what would that look like? Bit hard to say. Of course, Hitler himself was a madman, was a psychopath. There was many like physical and psychological things wrong with the man. So it's not it's not illogical to say like he was destined to self-destruct at some level. So I'm not here to say, Hitler was just this average guy. He obviously wasn't. And he had a lot of, he made a lot of terrible mistakes as the leader of Germany. He had a lot of bad judgments. A lot of the reasons Nazi Germany failed did come to bad judgments in foreign policy. But the thing is, the reason I think you know the idea of Nazi Germany conquering all of Europe is such a scary thought, or such an alarming thought, is because um, that at some level could lead to a high degree of self-sufficiency. If you have France and Britain under your wing, um, you're pretty good. You're pretty much good in terms of the resources you need. Your economy is going to be vastly improved from the resources of all the countries they would have had under their control. Um, and even if we take the argument that like Hitler was still going to personally self-destruct or personally kill himself, or he was going to die of syphilis or something, it's like, were his cronies or whoever like came to power after him, were they just going to give it all up after him and say, oh, he was just a crazy person, we apologize, have all your land back? It's probably unlikely. And I guess I'll just make one more quick point and I'll let you jump in here. A huge part of my argument, I think, does boil down to Nazism as an ideology. So Nazism meaning the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was such a strange animal, like politically. It's not really like, if we think about the right-left political spectrum, Nazism basically breaks down that political spectrum. Now, if we're fudging the numbers a bit, you could put like it's closer to far right politics, but that's not even quite. That doesn't even quite encapsulate Nazi ideology. So it was the ideology that was so dangerous. Really, it was less about Hitler, the man, although he was personally he was a dangerous individual. But it was the how dangerous Nazism as an ideology was, and we'll get into that as the podcast progresses, that I think is my contention, and that's why a Nazi-dominated Europe would have changed the world for the worse.
Yeah, so I mean, I obviously think that it's better if, it's easy to say in hindsight, like, oh, if this area never was occupied by the Nazis, that's a good thing. But I think what a lot of this conversation, at least in terms of if Nazism and if the German, if the German nation as it expands, if it could maintain itself, it comes down to a lot of thoughts on, I guess, imperialism and big government. Because what is clear in the Nazi regime is Hitler is the person who is in charge and is making the big calls. And a lot of things that are in his head are what are getting put into action. So a lot of things that are his desires are the things that manifest in policy. So I think it's wrong to say that Hitler made some bad decisions, because I think it's just Hitler endemically had bad big picture views that weren't going to work as a leader. But he was an inspirational leader to millions of Germans, so he was able to rile them up. So, okay, so I want to expand on like reasons why it was completely unsustainable, even if Hitler lost power, if the Nazi if the Nazi power structure, even if it didn't go into chaos after Hitler would inevitably die, there's reasons to think it was doomed to fail. Okay, so what are these reasons? Well, even in Germany itself during this time period, there were like insurrections that Hitler had to quell, and there were people who would actively essentially resist in a way that it's almost in like a way that we'd seem as normal. It was just like kind of basic forms of rioting or basic forms of like protesting, where people just weren't happy being workers for Hitler's party. So people in Germany itself were standing up to Hitler, but they're being, there were dissidents. I guess that's what I'm saying. Even from the start, there were a large amount of dissidents that essentially assisted to resist Hitler in ways, and that was even in his homeland. So you have those populations you're always dealing with. So that's the first thing. Okay. As he expands, right? So imagine that he did take over Britain or France. That's only going to get worse. So if you're saying Hitler takes over a country, it's like, well, what does that really mean? It could mean that the French military has given up and Hitler now isn't worried about being assassinated while he's in France. but it doesn't mean that the population that was allowed to live is happy working for Hitler. So it doesn't mean that they're actually going to be effective production centers for Hitler and Hitler's needs, because there's a bunch of people who probably aren't very happy that Hitler took power. So this is kind of the issue with imperialization a lot of times. And it's kind of like why you can make a case for slavery being economically inefficient, because slaves don't have a lot of good motivation to be good hard workers other than the threat of violence. So, and even though there's that threat of violence, it's like, okay, well, a slave is going to do the minimum work that they can get away with without getting beaten, right? So that's kind of how you have to think of occupied populations that don't want to be ruled by their new ruler. So it's not like just because you got Britain and France, they'd maintain the same productivity. It's like, no, they'd have to be beaten into submission, and now they have way lower incentive because everything they're doing for a cause that just could have killed their family members and destroyed the nation they grew up in. So it's not like you can't just say, oh yeah, it was apples before, and now when Hitler takes over, it's still apples. It's like, no, you've wrecked the nation that you've taken over. It's way less efficient. Okay, so that's why I'm not as concerned with the imperialization, and taking over other nations, leading to higher productivity. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit more about autarky in general, and just say, I just want to double down on how important it is, because if the United States, you can jump in. You can jump in before I go down another tangent. Where you?
Yeah, I just we can talk about autarky, but I just want to mention something based on what you just said. But it's true. There definitely would have been and was armed resistance. There's no question about that. And then, of course, it becomes a question of who has the upper hand, Nazi Germany or the armed resistance. And the other part of this picture, though, that we didn't think about is, of course, when we talk about World War II, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is the Holocaust, the genocide that killed 6 million Jews, as well as other undesirables. Now, the interesting thing about that, at some level, is that was the beginning of the Nazi Party's entire plan. It was not just like after they'd done that, they weren't going to say, okay, we're done committing genocide, guys. We're going to go back to, now we're going to advocate for stuff that's actually good for the people. It's like, no, that was the beginning of a campaign that would have been far larger and would have killed far more people. He wanted to kill Slavic people. He wanted to kill homosexuals. He wanted to kill communists. Of course, he wanted to get rid of anyone of Jewish origin. He didn't want to get rid of Southern Europeans, although he thought they were inferior to Northern Europeans. But again, I don't think we can underestimate the power of genocide. It was going to be a complete and total alteration of the kinds of people that were living in Europe. So it was genocide, and then it was recolonization. The Nazi Germany wanted to get rid of all the undesirables so Germans could live all across Europe wherever they wanted to. That kind of destruction is can really quickly, I think, ruin morale, and can really quickly put people, force people to submit. The level of terror. The level of terror was far beyond anything Joseph Stalin could have ever dreamed of at some level. And the other thing I wanted to say, the thing about empires, one could make the argument that ultimately they fail because nothing lasts forever. But I mean, it's not impossible for a Nazi empire to have existed and to have existed for a while. Now, unless we're arguing that Nazi ideology was so awful that it just couldn't do anything properly, which might be your argument to an extent. But I mean, Britain had an empire. France had an empire. There was the Roman Empire. I mean, there are a lot of empires that lasted for quite a long time, and many of those empires did terrible,
Yeah, but
committed. Let me finish. They committed terrible
yeah, okay.
crimes. They like so empires can do terrible things to a certain group of people and still survive for long periods of time. So I don't quite buy that part of your argument, at least.
Okay, so two things. One, we'll come back to the Holocaust because I kind of feel like you jumped in and said that, and it's like, well, we get there, but that had nothing to do with the economic point. If anything, it drives home the economic point that when you take over places and then slaughter a ton of their working population, then the masses that you took over are they're worth a lot less, which is going to be, it's going to hurt the region you took over in your empire.
Well, I bring that up because I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. But
well, I just think
brought
that's
that
like
up
a huge
because
thing that is like so much more detailed that like I'm like, okay, but we can't. But if we're going to talk about this, the empire itself, it's like we can wrap around to that in a minute.
But I mean, I guess it's important to bring that up though, because actually, Nazi ideology did de-emphasize like economic issues. That's just a historical point. I think it's important to keep in mind. People like Hitler, they weren't terribly concerned with economic issues,
Well,
and that might play into your point, by
exactly,
the way.
yeah,
But
exactly.
so it's but I brought up the genocide for the reason that that was a huge part. That was a part, a big emphasis of the ideology, and another reason why we should have gotten involved in the war. Go ahead.
Okay, so the other thing is you can't compare other empires that last a long time to the German regime because the German regime was, you have to remember how much of the population they were mobilizing for the war effort. And as so Hitler, who wasn't, his primary concern wasn't economics. Well, what happens if you put a ton of people into war in your nation? They aren't producing anything, right? So if you have people who go to factories and they make widgets, or you have people who go to mines and they come back with resources, you're making tangible things in an economy that go into the market, and then you have more of a good, and then people's lives are better. But when you put people into war, you're taking people who could be effective sources of generating anything for society in terms of well-being, and you just have them shoot bullets all day, or you have them stand still all day watching something. So these people aren't producing anything. You're just getting paid a certain amount of money, right? But they aren't adding anything that ends up going back into the society that they live in, or into the economies that they take place in. So what happens is you have this huge death toll from both the Holocaust and both from fighting all these wars. You're mobilizing resources in fights all the time in conflicts, so people aren't making stuff. So your quality of life in your regime doesn't get any better. And that's something you can't just neglect. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so against the war state in the United States now, is because when you think about, like, say, the Pentagon, and you think of all the high educated resources that we have sit there and then plan on who's getting bombed next, or they work on some weird strategic vision for long-term planning. It's like, well, you're wasting human capital. This human capital could be used to make people's lives better, but it's not. It's thinking about war, and it's doing things that aren't valuable in anybody's life in terms of the market and well-being. So that's the other point I wanted to get to. Now, okay. So the Holocaust, is that the animal we want to tackle next then? Because I've tackled why I think well, and then the last thing is, if you're going to invade
You wanted
Russia,
to bring up autarky,
yeah.
I think.
Well, okay, yeah. So the other thing is, since the idea was they'd be self-sufficient because they were worried about outsiders, because the whole World War I, where outsiders decided to cut up their nation and to penalize them, they were very afraid of outsiders, and they wanted to, the idea of being self-sufficient was very appealing. But you can't be self-sufficient if you take a huge portion of your working age males and you put them all in the military and you kill a bunch of civilians, and then you refuse to trade because you don't want to rely on other nations. So you're essentially destined in the middle to long term, at least. It could even be in the short term. You're essentially destined. You're setting up a proposition where everybody is going to have a low standard of living in your nation, and you have an authoritarian ruler, and that's when people are most likely to attempt to, have insurrections against an authoritarian ruler, is when their lives are getting worse. So a lot of things that we saw in Germany that have to do with like their currency being worth nothing at its end of days, I could see happening naturally, even if they're winning battles, because they're all like, well, we don't have anything. And everybody here is dying because we can't get our basic resources because everybody's just fighting aimless wars, you know, because we're just pursuing expansion, you know, brainlessly. And it's not like Britain and France were the final frontiers. He wanted to go to Russia. And any war in Russia has pretty much, in that time period earlier, ended up being, you know, a lost cause because you're fighting in terrible conditions and there's a huge amount of land you have to traverse. So I just don't see any of those factors playing in Hitler's favor in any real way, and unless you give him like huge credit for some military successes or from the economic side I'm not familiar with. But I don't think any of those things could lead to a country that actually is livable for even a slight minority of the population. So imagine like 10 years down the road, imagine if Hitler was in power through 1950. It's like at that point, I see them having no stuff. And even if they got to take over all these land masses, if there's resistant populations, you have to keep the military resources there. And you have to have people making sure compliance happens. So you're wasting all this human capital on compliance. So all those people who are trying to emphasize compliance because you have all these nations that you've taken over and want people to go along with your agenda, but they're really against it. Well, now you have to essentially have them on lockdown at all times because you don't trust the French just because you won the war. It's like, no, you need people there with guns, making sure that they don't rise up and making sure people aren't plotting your downfall. So that's part of the endemic issue of being an authoritarian regime that wants to expand. You're either going to expand it into an area and then have to keep them on lockdown and have guns to people all the time, or you let people get away with plotting insurrections and then trying to kill you all the time in an area that you were supposed to own. It's like you have to pick one because the people don't just give up, especially in that time period. So I don't see him expanding being actually like a good thing in the long term for his regime because it's stuff that he now has to expend more resources on, or it's still going to be a threat, and he never like truly, you know, owned it without threat, especially like Britain and France. Okay, go ahead.
I almost think that you might have a too positive of a view of how people will behave when confronted with atrocities or governments that are willing to commit atrocities, because I mean, Germany is just one country, of course, but there were plenty of people, in fact, probably the majority, at least that weren't Jewish or Polish or homosexual or communist, or the Germans that were Hitler liked or was willing to tolerate at least. A good portion of them did not do anything. A good portion of them did not resist. A good portion of them just kind of went along to go along to, I forget the phrase. They went along to get along. They just living their lives the best they can. They didn't want any trouble. I don't think it's actually that improbable or that crazy to speculate that the Nazi regime could have gotten a large group of people in a place where they would be compliant. And then on the economic point, and you know more about economics than I do, so I have to defer to your expertise in that sense. But you're referring to the waste of human capital. Now, I'm the first one that mentioned the genocide, of course, but the Nazis didn't just kill all undesirables in the sense that they did force them to work, force them to help they forced the certain undesirables to benefit the German economy. Now, of course, you could go back to the other argument about slave labor not being economically profitable. But it wasn't that all this human capital was being wasted. Most of it was, but the Nazis weren't completely they weren't completely wasteful in that sense. That they were willing to use, they were willing to force people to help further their cause. And then if they, once the people had, once Germany had gotten to a more stable place, then they would have discarded those people, of course. But and then the other thing is, again, what about I don't think you're bringing up resources. Europe is very rich in resources. So if we have a Nazi conquered or Nazi controlled Europe, they have access to a wide range of resources. And I don't think that can be underestimated. And that would have helped the helped Nazi Germany's economic. It would have helped their economy greatly, because countries like France and Great Britain were extremely powerful countries, and so if when they conquered France, they didn't quite conquer Britain, but if they had conquered Britain, of course, they would have put a puppet government in Britain like they did in France, and they could have extracted the resources necessary, kept some for the populations in the local areas, for the native populations that they were willing to keep around, extract the others for other parts of Europe that didn't have those exact resources. So it was not as if they were completely destitute economically.
Well, okay, so what I would say is, you have countries like Venezuela who have a ton of access to things like oil, and they still end up becoming impoverished. And then the reason why is because you have to have the infrastructure to effectively work with those resources. So everything Hitler does is disrupting the ways that the countries who currently had access to those resources handled them, right? Because he takes over the countries, and he essentially is turning everything into his regime that answers to him. So, and when you're enlisting anybody could be useful in your army or in your militias or anything that enforces your regime, then you don't have the people there to go, oh, you guys had this in mine. Okay, well, it's okay if all of you guys keep working in that mine. And then all the people who work in that mine, if they don't get drafted in the military, they're like, well, now I'm just doing this not for my own gain in any way. I'm doing it because the guy with the gun said to do it. And then they find ways to work less hard because the new overseer with the gun doesn't actually know how they've been doing their job for the last 10 years. So I guess what I'm saying is that they're almost like multipliers of inefficiencies that layer onto things once you use the power of the gun to tell people what they have to produce. Because you take away incentives for them individually, and then you take away the types of people that have been working in it, all these things. So it's like, yeah, they'd have a wealth of resources, but their ability to maximize them is like very insignificant. So it's like, yeah, sure, there's a benefit, I'll grant that, but it's like they're not going to be using it the same way that the people who, at least in their own mind, saw themselves as free people doing things on their free will did it before, or people who are doing it because it lined their pockets. It's a whole other incentive structure that ends up kind of screwing them over. Now, the thing that I wanted to go back to is kind of how you mentioned how so many people are compliant. So, and this is something where it's like there will be a town and there will be a concentration camp just over the hill, and those people like kind of always knew there's a concentration camp there, and they kind of just didn't really care. And that is definitely a thing that happened, in Europe at this time. But it's not. It's kind of like the insurrection that happened at Capitol Hill recently. Well, how many people were there? It's like thousands. How many people are in the United States? Hundreds of millions, right? So the amount of people you need to do something chaotic is a very small amount of people. So even though 90% of people can inherently be compliant, if you're worried that 10% of people are going to be the ones meeting in basements, planning on ways to disrupt the regime, then they have a huge problem, because 10% of people is still a ton of people. And this is something that's pretty well documented in Germany during the rise of Hitler, is people who were resistant to Hitler, but they were like essentially teenagers. And they were teenagers who kind of like, you guys are stupid authoritarians, and we're not going along with it. And they were essentially just, they would undermine Hitler in stupid ways by essentially just being like, teenagers, right? So that they would do things in the middle of the night to undermine Hitler's power, all this stuff. And all this stuff can seem like it doesn't matter, But when you have groups of people who clearly don't respect the regime and they're willing to plot things that undermine it, so it's like, yeah, Hitler could take over an area that has a very lucrative mine, but it only takes one person to put an explosive in a mine to make that mine like useless. So it doesn't take, even though there was obviously a high percentage of compliance in Germany and a lot of countries they took over, that doesn't mean that there's not enough to undermine Hitler's authority and make him expend a ton of human capital to maintain, his like power. And that's what ultimately undermines large fascist regimes. And that's why they're not successful for hundreds and hundreds of years unless they do things like commerce, and stuff like that, and then find other ways to maintain their power.
I think my argument, though, rests less on the possibility of Hitler fulfilling his desire of a 1,000-year Reich, and more speaking of the immense damage that they did and they could have done if I mean the immense damage they did, and even though they lost the war, is a horrifying, as everyone agrees. The damage that they could have done, even if they won the war, even if they completely self-destructed. Oh, hello? Hello?
Yeah, you totally lost sound.
Hello?
Okay, you got it back.
Oh, okay. Well, where'd you hear? Where'd you? Let's.
Hitler's desire, and then all of a sudden.
Oh, okay. Let me. Okay. I think my argument rests less on the idea that Hitler would have fulfilled his dream of a 1,000-year Reich, and more of an idea that the damage the Nazis did, even though they lost the war, was devastating, and it would have been far, far more devastating had they conquered Britain, or had they won the war, or had they stuck around for a few more years. That's really my main contention, because I mean, it is obvious to me that a good portion of Hitler's worldview was impossible. So he wanted a world empire, like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Napoleon, and like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon, they all failed, or he failed, because you can't have a world empire. It doesn't work. The world's too big to completely control, especially from one country. So he would never have created a world empire. But I think the question is, how much would Europe and the Western world have been changed if he had stuck around for 5, 10, 15 years? I can't see, I don't see any benefit. I don't see like that world being any better than this world. It would have been a worse world to live in. And I think that is where my argument about U.S. involvement comes in, because whatever U.S.'s crimes, whatever their failures, whatever the failure of FDR, whatever the failure of Churchill, however horrible Joseph Stalin was, there's a lot of things you can throw at the Allies, a lot of criticisms you can make at the Allies, but at the end of the day, they prevented Nazi Germany from doing any more damage than they already did, and I think that's enough for me to say the war was justified.
So I guess there's this meta question of, if you think the war is justified, at what point did it become justified? Because if FDR was proactive and concerned about the populations of people who were potentially going to be at risk in Europe, then he could have relaxed his immigration policies. because Germany was essentially trying to deport the Jews anywhere he could. But when so the final solution to the Jewish question wasn't officially a thing till 1942, and the concentration camps weren't opened till the United States essentially was in the war itself. So it raises to me that if you think the war is necessary, well, was the war necessary if FDR would have, in open arms, accepted a large immigrant population into the United States? Because that was on the table in the 1930s. But of course, it was the Great Depression, and the Jewish people were essentially stripped of their wealth as they were kicked out the door, if that was going to be an option. So they weren't an appetizing population for who you would take into your new country. So that wasn't something that was even considered really by anybody as a viable choice. And this is one of the reasons why I'm just, I guess, against states in general, because you have somebody who's like, well, in my interest as a person who's managing the economy, it is not effective for me to take in all these at-risk immigrant populations because they're poor. And then you still see this nowadays, right? You see all these people who live in horrible countries that we denied their entry because we have quotas and stuff like that. Well, the same thing applied at the time, and we didn't let Jews in. So I guess you mentioned that you're critical of what U.S. action was. I'm not convinced the war was necessary, because in my mind, it pretty much screams that it has to be necessary. And by necessary, I think of something along the lines of, if we didn't do anything, then it's like almost an existential risk in some way. But I see it as things could have gotten worse, but essentially things would have burned themselves out, and we would have ended up, well, that's my whole case for Nazi Germany eventually imploding, based on bad economics and the inherent problems of an empire. So you can argue that it got worse, but I don't think that doesn't meet my burden of U.S. intervention, right? And it could just be that we have different meanings of that. So I guess what I'm trying to put on the table is, what actions could the U.S. have taken earlier that would have made World War II not necessary? So when we talk about the Holocaust and all the people that were at risk, there were things that were options on the table before Hitler decided to start executing people. And you can argue that Hitler never gave the orders directly, but so you can argue that before he put out the final solution, he never gave out the direct orders, but everybody knew that was the main goal. And that's something that I've heard people claim, and that's how, like, a lot of, I guess, ideas are debunked, is with that. It's like, if you look at what he's saying, he's clearly dog whistling at the fact that they're going to kill all the Jews. But there were times where it was clear that they were trying to deport the people and nobody was willing to take them. So what are your thoughts on that? Should U.S. policy going up to 1940 and before Pearl Harbor have been different? And could the war have been avoided if the U.S. just had different policy? And I'm not saying that FDR should have known those things. I'm just saying, in the lens of hindsight, because we're talking about history, was the war avoidable if the U.S. did something differently in like 5 or 10 years leading up to it?
Okay, so yeah, this is this opens up a very interesting point, or something I was thinking a lot about yesterday or the day before. Your argument reminds me very of the argument that Thaddeus Russell made in the podcast. I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it, but he did a podcast. I forget the name of the podcast, but he was on some podcast to talk about.
He was on the Isaac Morehouse podcast. I think it's episode 132. If anybody wants to look it up, it was from like 2017.
Alrighty. So yeah, he was on that podcast, and he was giving, I think it was he was giving his take on World War II, which is different from the mainstream take. I think that what he was talking about probably is from his Renegade History, but I could be wrong about the particular book it's from. But when I hear people make that argument, and I'm not even saying that you or Thaddeus Russell are trying to imply this, but this is just where my mind goes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my mind goes to the responsibility always seems to be on everyone except Nazi Germany. The responsibility seems to be on, or the responsibility always seems to be on the United States and Great Britain and France and all these other countries. If they had just like contained this menace known as Hitler and known as National Socialism, if they had been smarter geopolitically, if they had played their cards right, they could have just like, you know, batted Hitler aside and batted Nazism aside. They could have saved the Jews, and you know, a lot of this could have been avoided. And I just think that kind of absolves the responsibility of those who committed the atrocities. And now you've kind of already brought up this point, but I'm going to mention it again. You know, it is true. The Nazis wanted, they wanted to get rid of all the undesirables. Again, Hitler wanted a world empire. And in that world empire, there aren't going to be Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, Slavic people. They have to be gone. He wasn't willing to just, and I know that I think Thaddeus Russell would disagree with me, but I don't see the evidence of this. He wasn't just willing to say, okay, guys, go far away from here. We won't bother you. Just stay away from us. No, he wanted them gone. He wanted them. He wanted all these undesirables. He didn't want a single undesirable on the face of this earth, practically. And so, and this he basically illustrates this in Mein Kampf, in his autobiographical manifesto that he published, I think, in the 1920s. So I don't buy the argument that that the Holocaust and the final solution was just a reaction to the war. That like it was like, okay, well, now we're at war. Now we gotta enact genocide. It was in the back of the minds of Hitler and the Nazi leaders all along. That 1942 just happened to be when they began their plan, which was it was meant to kill. The plan would have, if the plan had been successful, it would have killed far more people than we can even imagine. But let me answer your question really quickly, and then you can respond. I think they could have, if different countries and different world leaders had done different things. I do think the war either could have been avoided, or it would have turned out differently. That doesn't. I don't think that invalidates my argument, though, because things turned out the way they did.
Yeah, we have to deal with the conflicts. It was a separate question. I agree.
We have to deal with the conflicts that as they arise in real time, and unfortunately, we don't get to redo these things. But it's like, yes, should the United States have taken in more Jewish refugees? Absolutely. Great Britain actually took in quite a few refugees, Jewish refugees. So they're not really they can't really be blamed for that aspect of it. The U.S. can. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is a global problem. I'm sure many world leaders who are on the Allied side were actually anti-Semitic. There's no question about that. I'm going to leave that aside. I don't know enough to say one way or the other about that one. But then there's question. We haven't even talked about this. There's the question of like, we were allies with Joseph Stalin. WTF? You know, did we just, or the fact that like Eastern Germany, Stalin got to take over Nazi Germany, or Eastern Germany, excuse me, and he took over some other. Was it like 90% of Poland and parts of Czechoslovakia? I think Winston Churchill made a deal with Stalin behind closed doors on the back of an envelope, saying Stalin got a lot of this territory that they had fought to protect in World War II, I might add. But like he was on the Allied side, and I suppose Churchill and FDR figured, well, he's an ally, we got to give him something. So it's like, well, you can get like 90% of Czechoslovakia, or not 90% of Poland, 30% of Czechoslovakia, something to that effect. So on the Allied side was a mass murderer. So, and I know I haven't given quite specific. I haven't quite given specific examples of what could have been done, or what could have been done differently. But I guess I'm illustrating that. I'm not making the argument of like good versus bad, or good guys versus bad guys. I'm not saying the Allies were good, Nazis bad, therefore we had to destroy bad. It's like history is always more complicated than that. There really aren't good guys or bad guys. They're just people. People have different motivations and beliefs and ideas, and but that doesn't mean we can't make moral judgments based on history. And the Allies, again, whatever their flaws, were on the right side of that moral question, um, because again of how destructive and uh, I hate this term, but evil the Nazi regime was.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a few things that go into my thinking that I think kind of expand beyond what we've covered so far. So a couple of things that I hinted at. One, by asking you that question is I'm kind of hinting at what the idea is of a necessary war, and what does that even really entail. And part of that question is because there are things that I understand that Nazi Germany is ultimately responsible, but it's also like responsibility is not really a question. It's like a descriptive question, right? So it's like if we weren't picky about taking in Jews, could something have been avoided? And it's like, sure, it's still Nazi Germany's fault in the end, but if we could have changed it from happening, that would have been the optimal course of action. So that's kind of why I bring it up. I don't think responsibility is what matters, because that's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about thinking about it in a descriptive nature of what events could have changed things. So, but back to the point of what I was trying to make just now. So you have a few questions. You have like what makes a war necessary, and we live in a world right now where we know that there are re-education camps in China, but the only people who are going to argue in favor of going into China are essentially our modern day war hawks who kind of want to fight any war that's possible. We know that people are essentially slaves in North Korea, but we don't do anything about it. So it's like, okay, well, the Holocaust is different for a lot of reasons, but and I think one of the points you make about the Holocaust is that it's potentially winnable, and there weren't nuclear weapons, so it's a different landscape. So those are points of why it's better to consider going into that situation than it is, say, going into China tomorrow or North Korea tomorrow. But we still have these like immensely immoral, inhuman things that are happening in these other nations, and we would like them not to happen. And we're in any of those arguments, we'd essentially be saying something evil is happening abroad. So the thing to do is to go fight that evil. Now, what I think is so interesting about World War II, and that gives me a lot to think about, is the whole issue that we haven't brought up of Japan. So everything with Japan, Japan wasn't the ones rounding up the Jews, but we had a lot against we had a lot against the Japanese, and there's a lot of weird history between FDR and the Japanese, and it almost seems, and the thing that directly brought the America into World War II was Pearl Harbor. That was like the main event that initiated us deciding, okay, we're going full on for the war, and we're going to go fight the German. We're going to go fight Germany and Japan. So in my mind, even if you can make an argument that it was necessary for the reasons you've laid out, which I'm not really willing to accept, but if I was willing to accept it, it's kind of funny that I don't think that is the reasoning at all in what happened in real life. So it would at least be worth recognizing that doesn't line up with the United States' reasoning at the time. Because the United States' reasoning at the time appears to me to be that FDR did not like Japan and the Pacific having the potential power that they had. He was worried that the Japanese would become an imperializing force. And he did certain economic things against Japan because he didn't like that Japan was also potentially pursuing a regime that thought about autarky, and that's not good for United States trade. So FDR didn't like that, and he leveraged a lot of resources and naval bases that could be seen threatening to Japan. And it's not worth neglecting that according to and I know you heard Thaddeus Russell say this, but according to the memoirs written by FDR's advisors, on his second day as the president, he discussed in his second meeting with them about how they can go to war with Japan. So FDR historically has had it out for Japan in terms of not liking the power they controlled. So how much of U.S.'s intervention in World War II is for reasons that we can defend now by talking about the Holocaust and Nazis, but how much of the real reason that they were there was because the United States wanted to be a global power, and they saw Japan as a potential threat to that power. So I just think it's worth considering that even if you're right that it was a necessary war, the United States, there's a lot of indicators to me that seem like there was no reason why. That's the line of reasoning that the U.S. used to justify their actions at the time. Um, FDR specifically told the media not to report the amount of Jews that were dying because he didn't want that to hurt the popularity of going to war. The public reason was never to save the Jews. Jews weren't popular in the United States at the time. If the war was predicated on we want to go save the Jews or save these other groups, there wouldn't be support for it. So I guess the point I'm making, to briefly summarize, is Pearl Harbor is the direct thing that led to U.S. intervention, but FDR kind of wanted to go to war with Japan for at least several years before that. I'm not saying he knew about Pearl Harbor or any of those conspiracy theories. I'm just saying he didn't like Japan potentially being an imperial force or a force that'd be strong and maybe cut off ties with the U.S. And really, he was more focused on what was going on in the Pacific than what he was going on with Germany. He leveraged resources there. He fought that war. It looked good. But in the end, his whole agenda was always on Japan. So, yeah. So I know that's something you disagree with, so go for it.
All right. So there's, I guess, two things I want to respond to. The first thing, I want to direct everybody to a video by the YouTuber named Knowing Better. I showed you one of his videos, but I'm not talking about the video I sent you. This video is called Playing the Victim, Historical Revisionism and Japan. And this is a very good video because it talks about something that is just glossed over in American textbooks. That is Japanese fascism. And sure, Japanese wasn't rounding up Jews and putting them in concentration camps, but they did commit war crimes, and those war crimes were really terrible. And in fact, Japan has really never acknowledged or atoned for these crimes. People just kind of brush them under the rug. Some people responsible or directly or indirectly responsible, they kept their positions of power. They weren't, or they're honored in on monuments or in like particular war-related sites. So I don't have to like defend. I don't have to defend FDR's whole worldview on Japan. Not that I'm saying. Not that I'm saying you're asking me to do that. Not that I'm saying you're asking me to do that. But I don't have to defend his entire worldview on Japan, or even. I don't have to do that in order to say that Japan was a geopolitical threat. It was, if only to China and other Asian countries. But so Japan was not by any means innocent in this regard. Now, of course, we could bring up, the fact that FDR interned Japanese Americans. That's a terrible thing. Now, people call them concentration camps. They're not, at least not the way people think they are, because they weren't extermination camps, and more people went into the camps than came back in, or more people went out of the camps than came into the camps. So that's the first point. Japan was a country that was like Germany, like Italy, a danger. But the other point was, so I guess what I'm saying is I don't agree that like the Allies fought like countries like Germany and Japan just because Germany and Japan wanted to be self-sufficient. I think it was partly because these countries were dangerous overall, or their regimes were dangerous. The ideologies governing their regimes were dangerous. But the other thing is I'm making a moral judgment, which is it is slightly different from political judgments or even historical judgments, in the sense that I don't have to defend I can defend the U.S. going to war on moral grounds, even if we we uh, we didn't do everything we could to help the situation, even if we did things that hurt the situation. Um, I, because that's not a point that's mutually exclusive. Um, both things can be true. It can be the U.S. was morally justified to get involved in the war, and we did many things. We did many bad things, or we did things we shouldn't have, or we didn't uh, help as much as we could have. And again, it's like I don't have to defend FDR totally. I don't have to defend Churchill totally. I don't have to defend Stalin. I don't have to. That's really, I guess, my overall point. I can acknowledge the imperfection of these individuals and still say they were morally correct to fight the Nazis. They were morally correct to fight Germany, Italy, and Japan. It's a moral question. The politics and the human failings at some level are a slightly different conversation. Although I'm more willing, I'm willing to have that conversation.
So the question I'm asking is kind of more outside the box than you kind of restated your point and and you restated the discussion topic and then your stance on it, which is fine. But I was kind of trying to go for this outside the box thought, which it's so to tie it into, I guess, an example. Like imagine there's a terrible person who beats kids and abducts kids and does like the worst things imaginable to them, and then somebody like walks into their house and puts 5 bullets in their head, right? Okay. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, that was necessary because he's doing all these things to kids. And then, then you find out that the reason that guy did it wasn't because of anything he was doing to kids. It's because that guy never paid him back $15 that he owed him. So that's kind of what I'm posing. I'm saying, okay, you laid out the hugely immoral, gross things that Hitler and the war crimes that Japan's done and never atoned for, and such. And those things, I'm not going to imply that the Holocaust wasn't deeply immoral, and I'm not going to imply that Japan doesn't have some blood on their hands for terrible things. But when we learn history, it's all about the Holocaust. World War II, when you learn about history at high school, it's pretty much only about the Holocaust. And what FDR's thinking was in the 30s was, I don't like Japan. I don't like their expansionary policy. I see Japan as a threat, and I'm looking forward to a way that will let me go to war with Japan. And then once he's given the pretense, he takes it and goes to war with Japan. So everything we learn about is these atrocities of these countries, and it's like, yeah, sure, it's the guy who's the pedophile who beats his kids. I'm not going to complain that these clear villains got attacked. I don't think that's the issue. I'm just pointing out, like, it's weird that we act like the reason the worst of the worst is why we got into the conflict, when it's not why we got into the conflict. It appears from what I've seen that the reasons we got into the conflict is just we don't like Japan's expansionary regime. Japan's kind of fascist. They aren't a democracy like us. We want to go to war with Japan. So it's not really because Japan, did an atrocity and we got morally righteous. It's like all the leaders at the time were hawks that didn't like an expansionary regime that was not a democracy. So I was just asking, like, your reaction to that specific thought experiment.
You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. So I think the answer to your question, or the way I would answer your question, boils down to what the Allied forces would have done or did versus what the Axis powers probably or most likely would have done if they got the upper hand, if they had won the war. So the people talk about what it's called the German economic miracle. So like Germany after the war completely ruined. And that's not just because of the Allied forces. Like Hitler and the Nazis really did a number on Germany. At the point where Hitler realized he was going to lose the war, he was like, you know what? I don't care anymore. Destroy buildings, destroy bridges, destroy infrastructure. just burn it all to the ground. I don't care. If I can't get my way, destroy it all, basically, as like a 5-year-old, throwing a temper tantrum, basically, to illustrate, Hitler's ridiculous mental state. But and yet Germany is one of the most powerful countries in the world right now. Why is that? Because Germany was rebuilt, because the Allied forces tried to they didn't put harsh reparations on Germany like the Allied forces had done in World War One. They didn't just try to punish them. They actually tried to help Germany, and then of course they helped people through denazification. They tried to unteach people the ways of the Nazis, because the Nazi regime actually had a very they were very good at indoctrinating. They were very good at brainwashing, and so we had to do that to try to kind of hit the reset button. And the same was true of Japan. Now, of course, another thing we haven't talked about, and there's just so many things we could talk about. Another thing we haven't talked about is the atomic bomb. But Japan was, again, built back up. It was, and so I think that is a distinction to be made between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Allied powers, even if they were all completely cynical and immoral at some level, they also they also wanted Germany and Japan to be in a better place for the inhabitants. They didn't want to. They didn't bomb Germany and Japan out of existence. They tried to help Germany and Japan rise above the ash and the debris that had been left by the war. Germany and Japan, if they had won the war, I don't think they would have been as generous. I don't think they would have been as willing to help the people that they had conquered, or the people that had lost the war. I think that's a fact based on how pernicious and how I guess you could almost say unempathetic and unhuman, or dehumanizing, I should say, not fascist Germany, Italy, and Japan. How dehumanizing the ideologies of fascist Germany, Italy, and Japan were. And so that's really another aspect of the situation. The material conditions of Japan and Germany improved after the war thanks to the Allies. No matter how cynical or immoral, we're going to say, people like FDR and Churchill were. Because again, I think it's really important when we're talking about history, we can't get stuck, and I'm not saying you're doing this per se, but sometimes when we're talking about history, we get focused on one individual and think about FDR or Churchill. But we have to take a step back and I don't believe in the great man theory of history. The stuff that happens, it's thanks to many people, many different forces. So it's not as if the FDR's flaws are. We shouldn't just focus on FDR or FDR's flaws, or Churchill's flaws, when there's so many other people involved, so many other factors involved. So again, I don't have to defend any one individual to take this position that it was morally justified to enter the war.
Well, yeah. I wouldn't say that it's not morally justified to enter the war if it was for your reasons. That's just not what the proposition is, right? Because I think if we start a war with China tomorrow, I think there's a moral justification for it. I just wouldn't recommend it still. Now,
actually, can I bring up a meta point myself?
Yeah, go for it.
So I find myself in this conversation, on this podcast at least, being in the pro-war or position, or the position of defending the war. And then, of course, and you brought up this a little bit, although you haven't gone too much into it. You brought up war hawks and neocons and desire to go into other parts of the world, destroy the bad guys, and remake the country in what they view as a more humane image. But like, and as we haven't talked too much about foreign policy, but when we do, we almost always agree, because we are both against U.S. empire or U.S. imperialism, if you want to put it that way, U.S. interventionism. Uh, we don't think the U.S. should just throw its weight around. We don't think the U.S. should just invade a country because we don't necessarily like something they did, or we don't even necessarily invade a country for doing something immoral. But a distinction that perhaps I do have from you, because I'm willing to work within, or if I were a more practical person, I would be willing to work within the politics, the political system as we know it. I do think there are like times when intervention, military intervention, is justified. And basically, I guess my stipulations would be for like really stark, really obvious humanitarian crises. Um, so and the thing about World War II, and the thing about the war crimes and crimes against humanity that Nazi Germany and Japan were committing is that was that was a humanitarian crisis to the extreme, basically, right? And so I sent you another video. I sent you was an interview of Pat Buchanan, who wrote a book called Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, where he says he draws a connection between like the Iraq War and the World War II to illustrate, his critiques of U.S. foreign policy and his critique of what most people think of as a justified war. But I just don't agree that post World War II U.S. foreign policy is the same as the foreign policy done during World War II. I think it was because it was an extreme situation, basically extreme extreme. What's the phrase? Extreme times call for extreme measures, or something like that.
Drastic times call for drastic measures.
Something like that. Yeah. So I don't have to. Generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, and this is again, most reasonable people will say this. I'm against war. I think we should try to avoid war when possible. I'm not one that does think the U.S. or any country should throw its weight around militarily. I'm not for unnecessary interventions. I do think, in the case of World War II, it was a necessary intervention because of various factors coming into place. Again, some fault did fall on the Allied side, or on the side of like Britain and the U.S. and whatnot. But for whatever reason, we got to a point where, for various reasons, we got to a point where intervention, where the humanitarian crisis was at such an extreme that intervention was necessary. But again, I'm not even pro-war, or I don't like war. No one likes war unless you're a war hawk, and I'm not a war hawk. I'm not a neocon. I'm not gonna. I'm not. And I know you know all this, but I'm kind of explaining for the audience. My foreign policy analysis and perspective is very similar to someone like Noam Chomsky. In fact, his foreign policy writings are far more interesting and probably far more accurate than some of his other political writings. So so basically what I'm trying to say is I am very against American foreign policy as it stands, and as it has stood, if that's grammatically correct, for the past 50, 60 years or so, give or take. But I still fall on the I still fall on the side that World War II was a necessary conflict to get into from a moral perspective.
So when we talk about war, it's kind of like I fall in the situation where it's one of the critiques I have when it comes to everything the state does. Um, so I guess one way to frame it is by thinking that people who are dovish on war are similar to like the basic concept of what somebody who's a libertarian would be. And somebody who's a libertarian would say something along the lines of, and not an anarchist, but somebody who's okay with some government action and would consider themselves a libertarian would say something like, I'm very skeptical of government action, so I need a high burden of proof before I'm willing for that to be on the table. So somebody who's a dove could essentially say, they could essentially apply that to war and just say, I'm against war unless you show me like a absolute absurd amount of evidence on why we should go to war. The issue that I have with libertarians is a lot of people can present arguments that are perceived as good if you don't know how to show them like that they're wrong, right? So, this is why people are so convinced by, like, I guess a lot of Bernie Sanders economics is because he is really good at laying out what a problem is, and then he presents a solution. And I would sit here and I'd say, well, that solution doesn't fix the problem, or here's reasons why we shouldn't be concerned about that problem you laid out, so it doesn't meet the barrier. But other people who don't have as high of a bar to meet, or don't know the drawbacks that I'm seeing, they'll easily be like enthused, right? So when we talk about war, well, one of the concerns I have is any charlatan could convince you there's a good reason to go to war if you accept that war is really ever on the table. And I don't want to say I'm always against war no matter what, but it's really easy to convince somebody that there is a crime against humanity happening in another country, pretty much in most countries in most times of history. So like you can't do that right now with Europe, right? Because Europe is generally civilized now. But you could do that for pretty much anything in the Middle East, and that's why boomer cons get so, triggered when you point out anything about the Middle East, because they're like, well, they're doing all these things that are tyrannical. They kill their own people in these ways. They'll, pull guns on random civilians for no reason. Of course, we need to end state democracy. And you could actually have somebody who in their mind could think, well, I don't want to go to war for no reason, but that's a pretty good reason. So your question is essentially, Matt, what's the line? Because we're talking about the Holocaust. So I think so that's why I can make I can pretty much say, like, hypothetically, I would be morally in favor of us like going to war with China, because China has camps where they're killing people right now. And I can see the moral case for it. The issue is the government likes to take things and then they like to provide messaging that shows you why it's a problem, and then they then deliver something that either doesn't resolve the problem or resolves the problem while simultaneously like meeting their other ends that are much more nefarious or have a lot more personal gain. So that's what we see with the wars in the Middle East, right? So you can argue like there was the attack on the Twin Towers. There are these terrorist people who we should not trust. They're proto-fascist. We should go to war with them and instill democracy. And also like we can leverage more people into accepting the United States dollar when it comes to buying oil, and that will keep oil as the reserve currency of the world, which means we can print more money, and that benefits everybody in Washington, right? So that's the thing that you always have to be very weary of, and that's why I'd consider myself like definitely a dove. Now, the issue when we talk about World War II alone, to tie it back, I think it ends up in probably something that we just disagree about historically, and we've both observed different information from different people. Because I think what this comes down to for me is I think the timeline is probably something that draws a lot of, I guess, skepticism for me. So obviously Hitler very much hated Jewish people. I very much thought Jewish people were the scum of the earth in the 1920s when he wrote Mein Kampf, and he always had it out for the Jews, and he was very happy eradicating them if possible. Like that is all very true. But I don't think he, from what I'm aware of, in terms of actually putting concentration camps into place and actually deporting Jews on trains into places where they would meet their bitter ends, a lot of that stuff didn't start occurring until either the United States directly signaled they were going to go to war, or until the United States, after Pearl Harbor happened, they actually mobilized people. So it's one of those things where it's like the intent was always there for Hitler, and it was always an option on the table, but there are direct pieces of writing coming from Hitler's camp and coming from other types of correspondence that indicate that a lot of what immediately triggered his mobilization of resources was thinking, well, if I'm going to do it, I need to do it now, because now there's a threat. So it was kind of like the United States involvement in the war was something Hitler was always against. and he essentially mobilized a lot of the mass killing that occurred once the United States signaled they'd be in the war. Um, so I'm not saying the United States is responsible for it. Obviously, in the end, it's Hitler's fault. But I guess what I'm saying is, if Hitler was more complacent because he didn't see a direct threat in the United States, then maybe he wouldn't. There's no reason to assume he would have followed the same timeline. And assuming that is just like a weird way of interpreting history, because you can't assume things with all facts held equal. Um, so I've seen evidence that indicates that he wouldn't have mobilized them maybe at the same amount of time. I'm not saying he wouldn't have killed him in the end, but I'm just saying you're making an assumption, right? And I'm not comfortable with that assumption. So it's like, if I saw better evidence that indicated to me that you were right, then maybe I'd be more likely to be on the same page in terms of the humanitarian loss. But since I'm not 100% sold on that point, and I'm not sold on the fact like that Nazi regime would implode, I just don't think it's a given that it was a necessary war, especially when U.S. was only aggressed against by Japan, but we were aggressed against by Japan for a lot of reasons that involved us hating Japan for like a decade. So that's a lot of my hesitancy, and it comes down to probably a factual disagreement on the timelines and the different evidence we observed. So that's why I didn't bring it up till now, because I didn't want to squabble over this for an hour. And if I brought this up sooner, we would have squabbled over it for an hour. But I think that's just something we patently disagree on based on what we've observed so far. So feel free to give the other side of the story and why you take the opposite point on the issue of the timeline and when Hitler would have killed the Jews, and if that is not contingent on the United States involvement in the war.
Something that I keep taking shots at Thaddeus Russell. He's just one guy. He's just the guy who's been most of my mind because I heard his podcast most recently. But when he talked about, the conflict between Germany and the United States, he seemed to fail to mention that Germany declared war on us first. We didn't declare war on them first. Hitler declared war on the U.S. before we declared war on Germany. So my I guess disagreement with you and with Thaddeus Russell and people who have a similar line of thinking. Not saying you agree with everything Thaddeus Russell says about it, but I think we are. I think you guys are underestimating both Hitler's intentions and the intentions of the other Nazi leaders, and what they could have done if given the opportunity. Because the Second World War was the most atrocious conflict, the most bloody conflict in human history. And like the way I conceptualize it, and again, this is more in like what if history, speculative history, but the way I conceptualize it, it could have been much worse. And I think that the human cost, because the human cost could have been so much worse, I don't see a way of saying that the war was not necessary, given all the historical forces that were at play, and given the way history unraveled. If things had been different, if things had been a bit different, then I could see both world wars probably could have been avoided if things had gone differently. And actually, if you think about it, it's kind of silly to say World War I and World War II. We should really just think of it as one whole conflict that was separated by a little time in between. But it was really the same conflict. I think a lot of historians agree on this. It was really the same conflict, just you could almost think of it as a war from 1914 to 1947 with a little piece in between. One aspect of the Nazi regime that I that I failed to bring up, which I'll bring up in my closing statement, is all of the ideas, all of the art, all of the literature, all of the philosophy, all of the culture that Nazi Germany was quickly attempting to destroy. They wanted to discredit and get rid of a huge amount of the European intellectual tradition. because Hitler and his followers and other Nazi party leaders disagreed with um, a lot of European intellectual or the Western intellectual tradition. And so that's another thing that that I think is important to take into account. If Nazi Germany had won the war and stuck around for a while, I think the cultural effect would have been catastrophic in the sense that ideas that should not have been destroyed or should not have been brushed under the table or under the rug would have been brushed under the rug or table, and that would have been the end of them. So at some level, it was, and I'm not trying to be Eurocentric when I say this, but it was really a fight for the best. It was a fight for the best that of the European intellectual tradition. Not to say Europe hasn't done horrible things or there aren't bad aspects of the European intellectual tradition, but a lot of good ideas would have been destroyed by the Nazis had they stayed in power for any prolonged period of time, really. So the last thing I'll say is kind of a reiteration of my previous point. I am not trying to I'm not trying to excuse the Allies of any wrongdoing. For example, I think it was Christopher Hitchens who brought my attention to this. Everyone asks the smug question, where were all the good Germans? A lot of them were killed in the bombings that Great Britain carried out. They bombed a lot of working class cities where Hitler was despised, where a lot of Hitler's enemies were. We just killed them off, or we killed them off in the bombing we did. I didn't bring up, I brought up the atomic bomb use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki earlier. That was awful. That was a war crime. That was probably one of the worst war crimes in human history. That bomb should never have been dropped. So I am trying to give as nuanced of a take as possible. But I guess based on the way I look at the evidence, and based on the arguments I've heard, and based on how I assess Nazi Germany and Nazi ideology, that's why I come on the side of it was morally justified to get in the war. It was the bankruptcy of the ideology, the destruction it could have, the greater destruction it could have done had it been given more time, and certain distinctions between the Allies and the Axis powers that deserve to be talked about, despite all the hypocrisies and evils done on the Allied side.
Okay, and I guess to give just my closing summary recap, it's just so the way I interpret it is something along the lines of, I think Hitler was deeply incompetent. I think everything he signaled about his horizons, his long-term view of what he wanted to do with the empire, it was just going to be things that would inherently implode, and there's just no reason to think his management would be proficient enough, combined with all the counteracting forces, for him to actually realize what he perceived his destiny as. And that's one of the main things that keeps me from getting on board with thinking it's necessary. And then to go from that, it just gives me great pause that FDR wasn't necessarily brought into the war for the same reasons that we would say it's morally justified. Japan was kind of something that, based on a lot of his advisors, written correspondence and any of their biographies, they've kind of signaled that FDR was a hawk. He didn't like Japan's potentially imperial nature, so he fought it. And that type of reasoning I don't think is unique in history, but it's the same reason why we've gone into a lot of military conflicts that doves would be. This is my closing thoughts, buddy. You already had your chance to respond to these points. I'm recapping. So I would say the reasons that FDR gave, even if we can justify it post hoc for better reasons, it's similar reasons to like something that George Bush would say. It's a neocon reason. We don't like a country for their ideology, and they might expand, so let's go stunt it. The situation with Germany is different because of the Holocaust. I think there's a lot of historical things that we would need to probably address on a case-by-case thing, and then do our own recreation of how we see history playing out as certain events changed. And I think that's probably a very technical argument, and an argument that's based on a lot of intuitions, and I don't think either of us are educated enough to have those conversations. But I think I think that's the conversation we'd have to have if we're going to forecast certain predictions on how bad things could have gotten. Because I see things stopping at a certain point inevitably, even without U.S. interference. But if they didn't interfere, I think talking about how bad we actually think it would get would be something that we could do if we were both scholars that spent like 20 years reading on the topic and specific, turning points. And then I think my favorite thing that I'll probably revisit in this episode is probably talking about the economics of imperialism and the economics of just taking places over and forcing them to do certain types of work, and just the bad economics of having a military state, because you're wasting productive people. And then I think that's just something that you have to remember when they talk about war and public life, and you have to remember how many industries go into war. And whenever you hear people defending our budget right now, you have to think, wow, we're giving this much to the military and we have this many companies that flow into it. Well, it creates jobs. Well, it creates jobs that don't make anybody's life better, because you're making products that are only used for killing people. They don't improve our standard of living, having people making more planes for the military. And these are very smart people who are being wasted. And that's one of the travesties of the military that nobody talks about. Everybody who's educated that works at the Pentagon could be doing something that makes your life better. They can be working in companies that need people, but they aren't. They're working for the Pentagon. So yeah, we could argue about this for another hour, of course, but we've already done a good amount of time on it. So I appreciate you guys listening through. Feel free to check out our backlog of episodes that are on YouTube and your favorite podcatchers. As always, I'm sure we'll revisit a lot of the things we talked about, either point by point, or in spirit. We'll probably allude back to this conversation many times. So you can find our episodes on YouTube by searching Beyond Talking Points and The Anti-Philosopher, and then you can see our lovely faces as we hold back screaming at each other while the other person talks, and all that sort of thing. Okay, Matt, I'll give you two last words of just positive things that hopefully aren't just a 3-minute argument, and then we'll say goodbye to our listeners.
Yes. Well, I had something else I wanted to say, but I will let it go to for another time. I guess what I'll say is I hope maybe this is an opportunity for us to expand what we talk about more, because we haven't talked too much about foreign policy on this podcast. And obviously there are things other than foreign policy to talk about in the world. This is the 41st episode on pretty much non-foreign policy related stuff, although this is connected to foreign policy. So I would hope actually maybe we can think more about U.S. foreign policy, because I think we probably broadly agree, but there are also distinctions where we might disagree. So I think that's just another area of the podcast to explore. And as you said, hopefully, if you're listening to this, you got something out of it. We talk about politics, economics, philosophy, history now, just
morality,
pretty much morality, religion, whatever really catches our fancy. And we're just two guys kind of interested in a lot of these fundamental questions, but we have very different intuitions and different opinions. So what we do is we smash our opinions together in the hopes to come to some further understanding about these issues.
I'm glad you didn't say consensus, because we never come to a consensus. But we at least strive to understand the people who disagree better, and that's something that you don't get from CNN, I guess, or NPR, really. So I think I can comfortably say we both appreciate anybody taking the time to listen to us squabble over random issues, and you find it mentally stimulating. But with that long discussion behind us and many more to come, signing off, it's Matt and Matt.